Hello there. How are you tonight? Good. You've come to the right place. Not for excitement, mind you, but for a story so mildly entertaining, so soothingly uneventful, it'll gently bore you into the sweetest slumber this side of the Mississippi. Now, don't get too riled up, but tonight we're talking about brothels, not the scandalous kind. Heavens, no. This ain't that kind of tale. This is the historically accurate, overly detailed, occasionally dusty account of what it was like to be a Wild West brothel worker. That's right. Corsets, creaky floorboards, and customers with breath that could stop a stagecoach. It's a tale of survival style and slightly inappropriate pillow talk, but only the kind that wouldn't raise your heart rate past 65 BPM. Think less deadwood, more dead tired. So take a deep breath, lie back, and prepare for the slowest, most delightfully humdrum ride through brothel history your dreams have ever taken. Welcome to the yawn-worthy world of rouge, rustlers, and really uncomfortable furniture. And remember, no spitting, no gambling during story time, and absolutely no falling in love with a narrator. I'm just here to help you snooze. So there you were, or, well, so there someone was, stepping off a rickety stagecoach into a town with 2 saloons, 3 dogs, and 1 man loudly arguing with a fence post. Welcome to the Wild West. Population unconcerned with personal hygiene. The year was somewhere between the gold rush is still kinda happening, and we started calling snakes decorative pets. The streets were less paved and more soft dirt, mixed with hopes and horse droppings. You could tell a lot about a town by the size of its tumbleweeds and the number of buildings that leaned at a 45-degree angle. This one had both. Naturally, right next to the general store, which sold exactly 1 pickle in a jar and 5 slightly aggressive hats, stood the most enduring business in town, the brothel, or, as it was sometimes called, the boarding house for grown-up giggling, painted in a color that could only be described as faded red if you squint. It sat like a jewel in the middle of nowhere. If jewels were dusty, creaky, and had a strong scent of lavender perfume mixed with sorrow. Now, let's not romanticize this too much. The Wild West brothel wasn't all satin sheets and piano music. Oh, there was piano music, but the pianist was also the bartender, occasional dentist, and part-time boot shiner. He only knew 3 songs, all of which sounded suspiciously like Camptown races played backward. You'd enter through double doors that were never saloon style, because that only happens in movies. Real brothels had regular doors, the kind that creaked just enough to say something mildly disappointing awaits inside. A bell would ding. Someone upstairs would shout, tell him to take his boots off, and the madam would appear, usually wearing enough lace to qualify as a walking curtain. Now, if you were lucky, and I mean really lucky, the place had indoor plumbing, but most of the time, it had a wooden wash basin out back, which was technically private if you didn't. Mind sharing your bath with a goat named Edgar. Still, it was home. A home where you could make a living, hear stories, collect odd trinkets from traveling salesmen, and try to avoid stepping on any of the floorboards marked, "Do not step here unless you want to meet the basement." Cowboys came and went, mostly came, then tripped over their own spurs on the way out. They left behind buttons, gold dust, mysterious pocket watches, and occasionally poetry so bad it made the wallpaper peel. And so began the average day of a Wild West brothel worker, waking up to the sound of someone yelling about coffee, feeding Edgar the goat, dodging an unwanted suitor who swore he was gone. Nah, be a railroad tycoon any day now, and finding new and creative uses for talcum powder. It was dusty, it was loud, it was oddly sticky in the summer, but it was a job. And in the Wild West, a steady job that came with curtains, and at least one fork was practically high society. And really, isn't that what every sleepy listener wants to hear about? Getting hired at a Wild West brothel wasn't exactly a formal process. There was no paperwork, no interview, and certainly no resume, unless you counted the ability to flirt while balancing a tray of drinks as prior experience. The madam only needed to ask one question: "Do you own a corset?" If you answered yes, you were basically halfway to being hired. If you answered no, someone would toss you one and say, "Don't worry, it stretches, probably." A corset wasn't just a uniform. It was a commitment. A tight, squeaky, sometimes bruising commitment. It pulled, pushed, and redistributed you into something approximating hourglass-shaped distress. Beyond corset ownership, other qualifications included being able to pour whiskey without looking disgusted, having a decent wink, knowing when to laugh at terrible cowboy jokes, and tolerating the smell of boot leather and pipe smoke at all times. The madam would size you up, offer you a room with one mirror, cracked, of course, and point you toward the shared powdered tin. Training minimal. If you had charm, stamina, and a flexible relationship with personal space, you'd do just fine. And if not, well, Edgar the goat was always hiring for stable cleanup. Every proper brothel had a madam, and every madam had rules. Not many, but enough to keep things from descending into total anarchy, or at least mild carpet damage. Madame Ruby, who ran our particular establishment, had a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet and a memory sharper than her hairpins. She'd post the rules on a board near the front stairs, right under a crooked oil painting of a horse that looked suspiciously like her ex-husband. Rule number 1: No spitting indoors. This seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how many cowboys thought a potted plant was a spittoon. Rule number 2. No dueling in the hallways. If two fellows got too rowdy, they were asked to take it outside, where they could settle it with fisticuffs or passive-aggressive banjo playing. Rule number 3. No crying before noon. Madam claimed it kept morale up. Any tears before breakfast had to be disguised as allergies to the curtains. Rule number 4. Don't sass Edgar, the goat. He did bite, and he was considered stuff. Rule number 5. Always get payment before services. We learned this one the hard way when a man named Lyle offered to pay with good vibes and a button collection. Enforcement was strict but fair. Break a rule, and you might find yourself on broom duty or stuck talking to the piano man about his bucket of unfinished sonatas. Still, the rules made things run smoothly. They kept chaos to a manageable simmer. And as Madame Ruby always said, this is a brothel, not a barn. Unless it's Tuesday. Then it's a little of both. If there was one argument that could divide a brothel faster than a crooked poker game, it was this: saloon whiskey or bathtub gin. Saloon whiskey came in bottles that were dusty, unlabeled, and possibly refilled with tea during slow weeks. It burned going down, made you see colors, and occasionally turned into furniture polish when the bartender ran out of options. Bathtub gin, on the other hand, was homemade, often in the upstairs bathroom, behind a locked door and a sign that read, "Do not open unless you like surprises." It smelled like nail polish remover and bravery. One sip could knock out a minor. 2 sips could make him propose to a chair. The brothel girls each had their loyalty. Pearl swore by whiskey, said it kept her voice husky and her suitors generous. Lulu preferred gin, claimed it helped her see the future, or at least imagine it had better shoes. Mad Dog Marcy didn't trust either. She drank boiled water and glared at everyone else. The debate raged on during slow nights. Whiskey warms the soul, someone would say. Yes, but gin kills the germs. Another would reply, y'all are drinking kerosene and lying about it. Marcy would mutter. In the end, it didn't really matter what you drank, as long as it was poured from a cleanish glass. Didn't make you go blind, and helped you forget the fact that the piano man was now playing the same song for the 5th time. One thing's for sure. Whether it was whiskey, gin, or mystery liquid labeled Tuesday Special, it always tasted better when someone else was buying. Ah, yes, the corset, loyal friend, cruel enemy. And the reason every brothel worker walked like they had a secret. Wearing a corset was a daily adventure. It took teamwork, elbow grease, and occasionally a safe word. You didn't just put one on. You negotiated with it. It began each morning with a deep breath and a question. Do I want to breathe today? Or do I want to look employed? A good corset could cinch your waist tighter than a preacher's wallet. It lifted, tucked, reshaped, and confused your organs into new friendships. Rumor had it Pearl once sneezed and cracked a floorboard, from the force of her ribs realigning. The process went something like this. Step into it. Call for assistance. Hold onto a bedpost while someone shouted, "Hold still." Make sounds no one should hear before breakfast. By the time it was laced, you could barely sit, laugh, or blink too enthusiastically. But you looked like someone who had strong opinions about petticoats and mysterious European suitors. Corsets were never just corsets. They came with ribbons, lace, hidden pockets for letters or emergency snacks, and occasionally love notes from men named Dusty Hank. You'd wear it all day through tea time, dance time, and awkward conversation with a traveling dentist time. And at night, removing it felt like a religious experience. Everyone sighed, stretched, and swore they were switching to bathrobes. So yes, corsets were uncomfortable, but they were part of the job. Just like fake laughing, real winking, and pretending not to notice Edgar, the goat, watching you from the hallway. Scent was everything in the brothel business. You wanted to smell like mystery, money, and mild danger. Not yesterday's stew and horse, the perfume of choice. A little something called Miss Abigail's Floral Temptation. No, 3. A name that sounded elegant, but was mostly crushed violets. Rubbing alcohol and wishful thinking. One bottle could last 3 weeks or 3 minutes, depending on how much dancing was involved. Unfortunately, due to shipping delays and one incident involving a ferret and the supply wagon, substitutions were often made. This led to creations such as Back Porch Breeze, mostly lavender and soap flakes, Cowgirls, Midnight, smelled like moonshine and old leather, and the ever mysterious rose something, which may or may not have had actual roses, or possibly raisins. Applying perfume was a ceremony. You'd dab a little on the neck, behind the ears, and under the knees, in case of surprise proposals. Then you'd walk through a cloud of it like a slow-moving ghost with excellent manners. However, not all perfumes stayed where you put them. Sometimes, on a warm day, the ingredients would shift. Pearl once dabbed on a particularly old bottle and ended up attracting moths. Lulu wore a badge that made a dog fall in love with her ankle for 2 weeks. And one memorable evening, Mad Dog Marcy opened a bottle that hissed. We never discussed it again. Still, smelling good, or at least not dangerous, was part of the job. You didn't need the best perfume, just something better than the customers, which, frankly, not every night in the brothel was buzzing with cowboys and coin. Some nights were so quiet you could hear the wallpaper sigh. On those evenings, when even Edgar, the goat, looked bored. The girls had one reliable way to stay entertained: gossip. And not just any gossip. Front porch, curl your hair, pass the biscuits, gossip. Did you hear Pearl got a letter from that banker in Cheyenne? Signed it yours, forever, probably. Lulu says the piano man used to be a dentist, but he lost his license in a painting contest. I heard Mad Dog Marcy once dated a preacher, but left him for his horse. Stories flew faster than loose corset strings. They were rarely true, usually exaggerated, and always fascinating. You never really knew who was dating whom, who'd been caught kissing behind the barn, or whether anyone actually saw the sheriff cry during that poetry reading. Of course, gossip wasn't just for entertainment, it was also currency. Knowing who was sweet on who owed who money, or who secretly wore toe socks gave you power, or at least a good reason to giggle into your teacup. When stories ran dry, they moved on to guessing games. Who would fall asleep at the card table first? Always Deputy Clyde. Who would try to pay with exposure? Usually the poet with no pants. What exactly was in the soup tonight? Answer: don't ask. By midnight, the parlor would be filled with the smell of overcooked tea, faint perfume, and laughter that rose and fell like a lazy banjo tune. Because in the Wild West brothel business, slow nights weren't wasted. They were woven into legends no one would write down, but everyone would remember. In the brothel business, you never quite knew what you'd be handed at the end of the night. Sometimes it was a crumpled IOU scribbled on a plain card. And sometimes, if the customer was especially bold or especially broke, it was a button collection. Yes, buttons. His name was Clem. He swore they were vintage. Tips weren't just cash. They came in all forms. A miniature horseshoe for luck, or very small ponies, a love poem that accidentally rhymed pants with romance, a tin of questionable fudge, and once, memorably, half a ham wrapped in a bandana. We accepted most of it, partly because it was polite, and partly because Madame Ruby had a big box labeled things that might be worth something someday. Spoiler, they weren't tea. Still, the best tips weren't always shiny. Sometimes it was a gentleman who said thank you and actually meant it, or one who remembered your favorite tea, or didn't smell like raccoon stew. Every so often, someone would tip in stories, a wild tale from the trail, or a secret recipe for biscuits, which was 90% butter and 10% lies, and sure, money was the goal. But collecting little treasures made the long nights a little sweeter, although we did eventually have to make a sign. No tips in buttons, stamps, or live frogs. Again, Clem wasn't happy about that one. Every brothel needed a piano. It didn't have to be in tune. Okay. And it didn't even need all its keys. It just had to make noise loud enough to cover awkward silences and mild emotional breakdowns. Ours came with a man named Eugene, a fellow with a mustache like a suspicious broom, and exactly one song in his entire musical arsenal. We didn't know what the song was called, but it had a jaunty little tune and a confusing middle part that made everyone think it was over, until it wasn't. He'd pause, wait 3 beats, then continue like nothing had happened, every single time. Eugene claimed to have trained formally, but we all assumed that meant he once lived near a music store. Requests were welcome, but rarely honored. Do you know Buffalo Gals? Gifts no, but this one has Buffalo energy. Can you play something slower? Gifts I can play this same one slower. Could you just stop? Gifts, that's a different rate. It became a running joke, a musical background to everything from sweeping floors to applying rouge. Sample lyrics included, "Oh, the soup is cold and my corset's tight. Eugene's still playing. Lord, save us. Tonight some customers assumed it was a very long, complex ballad. Others thought it was a form of torture. One man claimed to hear it in his dreams. Still, Eugene was reliable. He showed up on time, kept rhythm, and had only fallen asleep on the keys twice that month. And really, what more could you ask for in a brothel piano man? Well, maybe 2 songs, but that's just being greedy. Fashion in the Wild West brothel was less about trends and more about flair. And by flair, we mean lace, sequins, fringe, and whatever shiny object you could stitch to a skirt without it falling off mid-wink. Rule number 1, if it glittered, glowed, or made a slight jingling noise when you walked, it was in. Every girl had her signature look. Pearl wore more ruffles than a bakery. Lulu preferred velvet so dark it could absorb secrets. Marcy refused anything that didn't have at least one hidden weapon sewn into it. But the real star of the outfit was always the hat, feathered, beaded, and often tall enough to block the sun. Brothel hats were both fashion statements and small wind sails. You didn't wear a hat. You negotiated with it. And if the wind picked up just right, you could find yourself chasing it down Main Street like a chicken with a gambling debt. One particularly ambitious hat, worn by Lulu, had 3 peacock feathers, 2 velvet roses, and a tiny silver spoon for reasons never fully explained. It once got caught in the chandelier during a hike demonstration and had to be retrieved by lasso. Fashion wasn't about comfort, it was about impression. You wanted to look like $1,000,000, or at least 10 very confused dollars. Stockings were always slightly mismatched. Gloves were optional but encouraged, especially if you were hiding bad poker hands or suspicious bruises from corset combat. No matter how frilly, wild, or possibly haunted the outfit. You strutted like you meant it. Confidence was the best accessory, followed closely by emergency hat pins. And if all else failed, slap on a boa, wink at the mirror, and remember, you're not overdressed. Everyone else is just boring. If the brothel was a ship sailing through the stormy sea of cowboy nonsense, the madam was the captain, steering it, managing the crew, and occasionally whacking people with her fan when they got too rowdy. Our madam was Miss Ruby Calhoun, a woman with a voice like honey and a stare that could curdle milk. She wore velvet gowns, smelled like cinnamon and subtle threat, and had exactly 0 time for anyone's excuses. The madam didn't just keep the girls in line, she ran the whole operation. Finances. She could calculate tips in her head while drinking gin and balancing a cat on her lap. Scheduling. She remembered who worked Tuesdays, who owed her laundry, and who wasn't allowed near the piano anymore. Lulu. Conflict resolution. Usually handled with a raised eyebrow and the phrase, "Do we really want to do this in front of the goat again?" She kept a ledger thicker than a preacher, Eskild, and guarded it with a kind of suspicion, usually reserved for gold mines and secret chili recipes. The madam's office was a mysterious, magical place, filled with perfume bottles, spare stockings, emergency chocolate, and letters from men across the West who all claimed to miss her terribly, despite forgetting her birthday. Being a madam wasn't all glamour and feathered fans, though. She had to deal with drunk minors who thought their money came with opinions, girls who fell in love with cowboys who owned half a horse, deputies who paid in promises and sad harmonica solos. But through it all, she stayed sharp, smart, and surprisingly fast with a shoe if needed. They called her a businesswoman. They called her bossy. They called her Ma M, unless they wanted to be asked very politely to leave through the window. And no matter what happened, she kept the lights on, the tea hot, and the girls safe, which, in the Wild West, was no small miracle. The guests at the brothel came in all shapes, sizes, and levels of bath time commitment. Some were charming, some were weird, some smelled like they'd wrestled a skunk for fun and lost. And then there were the unforgettable ones, like the man who arrived wearing 3 vests and said nothing but ma'am for 6 hours straight, or the poet who paid in poems, each worse than the last. Your eyes are like beans, wet beans, but the true legends were less human. One evening, just after sundown and slightly before reality, a chicken wandered through the front door, calm as a banker, walked right in, hopped onto the registration desk, and pecked once on the bell. We stared. The chicken stared back. Madame Ruby, without missing a beat, said, "Put her in room 3. She's got better manners than Earl." To this day, no one knows where that chicken came from. or where she went. But she did leave an egg on the windowsill. And honestly, that was more than some guests left as tips. Of course, the ghost stories were part of the ambience. Room 7 was said to be haunted by a gambler who lost everything, including his mustache. A faint piano tune could sometimes be heard when Eugene wasn't playing, which was unsettling since he never stopped playing. And Lulu swore a cold breeze followed her whenever she wore her cursed feather boa. Though that may have just been the open window she refused to close. Still, ghosts weren't really a problem. They were quiet, didn't complain, and never asked for change for a $5 bill. In fact, if you listened carefully on slow nights, you could swear you heard someone whispering compliments from the shadows. Probably the chicken. Every afternoon, sometime between laundry disasters and someone misplacing their corset again. The brothel held a sacred event. Tea time. Now, don't let the fancy name fool you. This wasn't the Queen's garden party. This was 8 tired women in mismatched robes, slumped in velvet chairs, sipping strong tea like it owed them money. The tea itself, questionable. It came from a tin labeled imported delicacy in handwriting that suspiciously resembled Eugene's. It smelled like flowers, tasted like dust, and occasionally had a raisin floating in it. No one asked why, but the real star of tea time was the biscuits. Golden, crumbly, possibly made with butter and a small bribe. The recipe was Madame Ruby's secret, known only to her and a squirrel she once fed in a moment of weakness. The biscuits disappeared faster than gossip in a prayer circle. One day, they began vanishing before the tray even hit the table. Theories erupted: ghosts, gremlins, Lulu sleep snacking, Eugene stockpiling carbs for winter. Ruby was furious. If someone doesn't confess, she warned, we'll switch to saltines and regrets. We left a tray of decoyed biscuits and pretended to leave the room. 30 seconds later, the tray was empty, but the only clue, a single tiny feather, and some suspiciously buttery paw prints. Turns out it was the chicken. Again, how she opened the pantry remains a mystery. Why she liked biscuits, also a mystery. But the message was clear. Nobody, and we mean nobody, messes with brothel snacks. From then on, one biscuit was always set aside, unlabeled, a peace offering, because even in the Wild West, some things are sacred. Tea, sisterhood, and not getting between a woman and her baked goods. It started like any other Wednesday. Eugene playing his one song, Marcy threatening her corset with scissors, and Pearl trying to seduce a biscuit. Then the front door swung open and in walked the mayor, wide-eyed, red-faced, and completely pantsless. Now, in most towns, this would cause a scandal. In ours, it just meant someone had lost a bet again. Mayor Archibald T. Peabody was a man of many things. Bluster, mustache, and unearned confidence. He fancied himself a man of the people, though most people wished he'd stop talking and put pants on more consistently. He stumbled in clutching a top hat, a crumpled newspaper, and what we hoped was a tablecloth wrapped around his lower half. "Ladies," he announced, "I come bearing." "What kind of civic matters don't require pants?" Ruby asked, without looking up from her tea. He blushed. It was a dare, he mumbled, from the town council. Something about relatability. We offered him a seat on a towel, poured him some tea, decaffeinated for safety, and listened politely while he babbled about upcoming town festivals, bridge repairs, and a new tax on marmalade. Meanwhile, Pearl slipped upstairs to find a pair of spare trousers. We always kept a few on hand for surprise guests. Romantic emergencies and, apparently, rogue mayors. Eventually, he stood up, declared the visit a tremendous success, bowed deeply, too deeply, and left wearing Lulu's backup pants, which were 3 inches too short and had rhinestones on the back that spelled hot stuff. The next day's newspaper featured a drawing of the mayor. The headline, "Peabody Goes Bare for the People," and a stern editorial urging pants be made a legal requirement during official business hours. We framed it. Cleanliness in a Wild West brothel was a journey. Sure, folks expected some glamour, feathers, perfume, maybe a velvet curtain or two. But nobody ever asked the real question. Where did all the soap go? It was a mystery every year. One day, we'd have stacks of lavender-scented bars in the cupboard, and the next, poof, gone, as if a hygiene-loving bandit had galloped through and left us high and dry and smelly. This led to what we solemnly referred to as the annual soap crisis of '79. Tempers flared. Marcy accused Pearl of hoarding it to barter for secret biscuits. Lulu insisted the piano was eating it. Eugene declined to comment. Ruby suspected the chicken. Meanwhile, customers were offered alternative options. A stern brushing with a broom. A splash of mysterious cologne that smelled like regret and licorice. Or the classic cowboy rinse. Stand near the rain and hope. Then came the bathtub drama. We had exactly one good bathtub. The other one wobbled like a drunk armadillo and made a squealing sound when sat in. Naturally, everyone fought for dibs on the good one. Bath time sign-up sheets were posted. Bribes were offered. At one point, a full-on wrestling match broke out between Pearl and Lulu over who got the 8:15 soak slot. Ruby settled it with a coin toss and a glare so powerful it nearly boiled the water. To be fair, Bathing wasn't all bad. We used rose water. We lit candles. Sometimes someone brought a harmonica for ambience until it fell in the tub and nearly ended Eugene. But let it be known, there was no faster way to panic in the brothel than the phrase, "We're out of soap again." Eventually, Ruby tracked the missing stash to a traveling preacher who had been discreetly buying it from Lulu to cleanse the town. He said he was ridding us of sin. We sent him off with a farewell wave and several very unsinful thoughts. After that, we hid our soap under lock, key, and a decoy tin labeled pickled turnips. And peace and baths returned to the house once more. Love in a brothel was like trying to hold a cactus, sharp, confusing, and likely to result in awkward explanations. Lust, that was easy. Lust walked in wearing muddy boots and a sheepish grin and said things like, "You free tonight?" Love was more complicated and often much, much weirder. Now don't get us wrong. Every girl had her admirers. Marcy had a miner who sent her rocks with hearts carved into them. Pearl had a banker who wrote her poetry that rhymed occasionally. Lulu got love letters from herself when she was practicing new handwriting. But the real story, the one that echoes in awkward legend, was Franklin and the goat. Franklin was a quiet fellow, sweet, shy, smelled faintly of mint and barn. One evening, he arrived in his nicest vest, nervously holding a bouquet of wildflowers and a goat. Not a metaphorical goat, a real, live goat, small, judgmental, and wearing a ribbon. "This is Clementine," he said. "She comes everywhere with me." We weren't sure if this was romantic, eccentric, or illegal. But Ruby had a rule. As long as nobody bled, broke furniture, or offended the wallpaper, we let people be. So Franklin sat in the parlor, ordered tea, offered the goat a biscuit, which she ate with great judgment, then politely asked Lulu if she'd join him for a chat under the moonlight. Lulu, ever the curious soul, agreed. 15 minutes later, we watched from the upstairs window as Franklin, Lulu, and Clementine, the goat, sat quietly under a tree, sipping cider and stargazing. No funny business, just a man, a woman, and a goat contemplating the cosmos. It was oddly wholesome. After that, Franklin visited once a month, always brought flowers, always tipped well, never once asked for anything more than conversation and, occasionally, advice on what goats think about thunder. As for Lulu, she said it was the most peaceful courtship I ever had, and the only one that didn't involve someone crying in the broom closet. Sometimes love wasn't a kiss or a grand gesture. Sometimes it was a gentle moment, shared with someone who brought their own livestock. We never saw Franklin and Clementine again after the great fence building incident of spring. Long story. Lots of splinters, but we wish them well. Wherever they are, we hope there's cider, starlight, and plenty of biscuits. Now, you'd think a proper crime in the Wild West might involve gold, horses, or possibly a suspicious number of raccoons. But no, this one involved underwear. It all started one muggy Tuesday morning when Pearl opened the laundry closet, let out a gasp, and yelled, "We've been robbed. All the bloomers are gone." At first, we thought she was being dramatic. This is the same woman who once declared war on a mirror for betraying her angles. But no, it was true. Every single pair of underthings had vanished. Corset liners, lacy drawers, petticoats, even Lulu's ridiculous ruffled bloomers with the embroidered cactus on the bum. Gone. Poof. Vanished into the bloomery void. Ruby called an emergency meeting over lukewarm tea and suspicious biscuits. Suspects were immediately assembled. Eugene, who once tried to iron a corset and set it on fire. The mayor, who claimed he hadn't worn underwear since the War of '68. The goat, who had recently been spotted near the clothesline, looking suspiciously fluffy. Then came the note. Yes, a ransom note, written in glitter ink. On the back of a flyer for Honest Hank's discount dentures. It read, "We have your underpants. Stop using so much starch. Meet us at the water tower at midnight. Come alone. Bring cookies." Naturally, we sent Lulu. She arrived at midnight with a basket of shortbread and a slingshot. What she found was beyond explanation. A group of rogue theater kids from the next town over, rehearsing a dramatic production called Whispers of the Petticoat. They had borrowed a hem, liberated the garments as costumes. "Authenticity," said the lead actor, wearing Marcy's monogrammed bloomers on his head like a crown. "The art demands it." Lulu returned an hour later with the underwear, a confused expression, and a small part in the chorus. After that, we installed a padlock on the laundry room and wrote nitrogen monoxide theater, kids allowed in chalk on the side of the building. The scandal became legend. The bloomers were recovered, and Ruby made a new rule. Anyone touching someone else's underthings without express written consent would be dunked in the horse trough. Twice. It all began with a dare. Marcy claimed she could walk in heels, recite Shakespeare, and wink at 3 men at once. Pearl replied, "That's nothing." I once flirted a man into buying a horse he already owned. Naturally, someone said, we should have a pageant. And just like that, the first annual Madame Ruby's all-gal spectacular brothel beauty pageant was born. Best wink under pressure, most dramatic feather boa usage, speed corset, lacing, and, of course, talent with very flexible definitions of the word, the contestants. Every woman in the house, plus Eugene, who insisted on entering under the stage name Miss Delicate Thundercloud. The judges: Ruby stern but fair, the mayor confused but present, and Clementine the goat, who was bribed with biscuits and remained mostly impartial. It started strong. Lulu performed an interpretive dance using nothing but a parasol and sheer nerve. Pearl played the triangle with unnecessary sensuality. Marcy read a love letter she once received from a dentist, and then dramatically lit it on fire. Then came the disaster portion. During the speed corset event, someone, we won't name names, but it rhymed with Turl, pulled a ribbon too hard, which ricocheted and smacked the mayor square in the monocle. Clementine panicked, kicked over the punch bowl, and galloped into the talent area, where Eugene was mid-recitation of a very emotional limerick. He screamed. The triangle flew. A feather boa caught fire briefly. Someone fainted into the biscuit tray. Ruby stood, clapped her hands, and declared, "We'll call it a draw." The pageant was never held again, though Eugene still wore his sash runner-up, but in spirit every Sunday at tea. In the end, we learned something very important. Brothel workers may be glamorous, theatrical, and full of flair, but we should never be allowed to compete for titles. We already have enough drama without the trophies. It began with a visitor from the East, a mysterious woman in flowing pants, barefoot, humming softly and carrying a rolled-up mat like it was a sacred scroll. Her name, Fern. Her profession, spiritual flexibility consultant. Her mission, to introduce the women of Madame Ruby's to the ancient art of yoga. Now, most of us had only heard the term whispered in saloons and vaguely mispronounced by Cowboys Yogurt. But Fern promised better posture, inner peace, and the ability to breathe through your ankles. We were intrigued. Ruby saw an opportunity to increase balance, physical and emotional. Lulu wanted an excuse to wear stretchy pants. Pearl thought it was a new type of slow dancing. So we cleared the parlor, lit some incense, which made the goat sneeze, and got to stretching. First pose, downward, dog. Half of us tipped forward. The other half yelled, "Where exactly is my downward?" Next pose, cobra. Eugene hissed too enthusiastically and was asked to tone it down. Then came the disaster pose. Happy baby. This involved lying on your back and grabbing your feet while smiling. In theory, this encourages relaxation. In practice, it encouraged several minor back spasms, one leg cramp, and Marcy yelling, "I've never been happy," or a baby. At one point, Pearl got stuck in a position known as pigeon pose and had to be gently rotated back to humanity, using 2 cushions and a broom handle. Clementine, the goat, tried to join in, possibly achieving enlightenment before headbutting the incense tray. By the end of the session, we were emotionally wobbly, physically pretzeled, and more spiritually confused than awakened. Fern floated out of the house with a smile and a pamphlet. We never saw her again, though we still suspect she may have been a ghost, or possibly just very relaxed. We tried yoga once more the following week, but Ruby replaced all poses with sitting still and drinking lemonade while thinking peaceful thoughts. It was our most successful session yet. Well, sugar, here we are, 20 chapters deep into the slowest, silliest, most questionably informative tale of Wild West brothel life ever told. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've either got insomnia or an alarming curiosity about corsets and goat-friendly hygiene. But let us take a moment to reflect on what we actually learned during our very sleepy journey. 1. Brothel work was less about romance, more about laundry. Forget the lace and longing glances. Being a working gal in the Wild West meant hours of washing, mending, and trying to keep the goat out of the bathtub. If love bloomed, it usually came with confusion and possibly a livestock chaperone. 2. Customers were not always charming. They came in all shapes, smells, and levels of politeness. Some brought poetry, some brought biscuits. One brought a goat and called it a date. None of them knew how to tip correctly, except one banker with a stammer and an unhealthy obsession with ankles. 3. The house had more rules than a fancy boarding school. No corsets after midnight. No perfume near open flames. No fighting in the broom closet unless it's over biscuits. And never, never start the bloomers without asking first. 4. We were a family. A dysfunctional, glitter-covered family. Sure, we argued. Someone always forgot to replace the tea bags, but we had each other's backs. Whether it was Lulu getting stuck in yoga pose, Marcy entering a pageant mid-feather meltdown, or Ruby using her glare to discipline time itself, we stuck together. Even Eugene, especially Eugene. 5. The Wild West wasn't so wild. It was just wonderfully weird, you imagine. Gunfights, outlaws, whiskey, and dust. And sure, there was all that. But there were also soap shortages, beauty pageants with goats as judges, and spiritual enlightenment in stretchy pants. We were pioneers in our own sparkly way. 6. And finally, don't put a cactus on the nightstand. It looks cute. You think it gives the room ambiance. But one wrong elbow in the dark, and suddenly you've got regret and spines in your behind. So what was it really like to be a Wild West brothel worker? It was ridiculous. It was exhausting. It was occasionally heartfelt, frequently itchy, and often filled with unexpected musical numbers. But above all, it was ours, our little bizarre corner of history. One cup of lukewarm tea at a time. And if you're drifting off now, dear reader, dream sweetly of ruffled petticoats, stampeding goats, and sassy women ruling their world, one corset at a time. Sleep well, sugar. We'll leave the lantern on. The end. Now seriously, go to sleep. Even Clementine's snoring.